Okay, everyone, welcome to this version on Thursday of our Learning Bites. I'm Angelique Beslic, and I am joined today with a special guest, Justin Poulin from Green Security. I'm super excited to have him here today. But as you guys know, we do Learning Bites every Tuesday and every Thursday from 3:30 to 4 Pacific Standard Time. So I'm so glad you're all here. And welcome, Justin. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, Angelique, thanks for having me. I feel like it's a long time coming. I've been watching what you're
Right.
doing, and we've obviously known each other for a while. So thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, this is going to be awesome. So, what are you focusing on today with your amazing education that you're going to be giving all of us?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think everybody's frame of reference is going to be vendor credentialing, but we're going to be talking about a lot more than that. Really, how are you managing all non-employees, and do you have a consistent process for screening them and knowing who's in your facilities? So I love the title here. From gatekeeper to game changer. We can definitely create, safety in our facilities, have some boundaries that are good for both parties as well as vendors and patients. And I can share a few stories in my travels along the way. I was originally a nurse, had worked on the provider side for many years, and then in 20, geez, I'm going to date myself here, but in 2010, I began my medical sales career and started my entrepreneurial career in 2015, and have been with Green since pretty much the very beginning.
So, are you kind of saying when you talk about safety, are you talking about like vendors sneaking in the back door, the receiving dock, that type of stuff, side doors?
Yeah, that's a piece of safety is the access, but it's also what do you know about the people that are coming into the building? And I'll even say, vendors means a lot of different things. It can mean vendor company, it can mean vendor representative. There's a whole category of service vendors. And then there's also facilities and construction contractors, which kind of waffle sometimes into that service vendor category. A lot of times when people are talking about vendor credentialing, they're really thinking about like the trauma and orthopedic reps that are going into procedural areas. But a common practice across the country is to issue hospital ID badges, not only to this sort of traditional version of vendor, but also to those service vendors and those facilities and construction contractors. And in a lot of cases, they're really not going through the same screenings that the employees are, and yet they have the same unvetted access.
Wow. Okay. Well, I can't wait to dive into this. Are you ready?
Yeah, let's go.
Okay, I'll move your slides for you. Here we go.
So, first thing is credentialing oftentimes is seen as red tape. And it really depends on the role that you play in the organization. And especially, I mean, I remember being a vendor rep. I saw this as a hassle. I didn't want to have to do this. Even when I first got my start with Green Security, I was excited about the opportunity to lead a new organization, but I definitely had thoughts around, well, I always used to see this as kind of a hassle. What I discovered over my years at the company is a lot of times I just don't think the awareness of hospital processes and the threats that actually do exist inside hospital walls these days is really well recognized by vendors, and rightfully so. They're there, they've got a job to do, they're trying to bring a product in. But at the end of the day, a lot of people simplify credentialing as this is a compliance checkbox, and they don't tie it to the larger initiatives that are within hospitals, especially today. Workplace violence is a major focus at the C level across all healthcare organizations in our country today. And so, what can we do to make sure that the patients and the staff have a sense of safety in their facilities? And we know like employee retention is a really big challenge in some cases, and I think that's a big part of it too. Speaking as a clinician and knowing kind of the clinical burden in hospitals today, is a lot of nurses have reported having incidences of violence in their facility. We know kind of the ED is an area that's troublesome. So when you ask me kind of like, where am I talking about? Well, I think everybody needs to be appropriately screened. The loading dock is a gap, but a lot of the violence that we see, especially for patient visitors, is going to occur in the emergency department. And so just having some screening and communication tools is really, really important. I think another thing that people kind of anchor on is the policing duties, right? Nurses are not trained in conflict resolution. They don't want to have to be the ones that go up to the vendor who they might have even gone to high school or college with and say, you can't be in here today. And so, I think solutions moving forward need to really remove some of that confrontational nature and have good escalation policies, et cetera, to be able to deal with this. And of course, vendors feel kind of restricted, but it doesn't have to be this way. And there are some important keys that are beyond just a compliance checkbox. But, infection prevention is critical. We know the financial impact on a hospital if a patient, comes back in for care because they had an infection. I'll tell you a story about predators getting access to hospitals. There's also a lot of inefficiencies and then just cost control, knowing the products that are coming in. Are they on contract? Are they off contract? Like, do we really have a good handle on that? And I know that's really to the heart of what you do on a day in and day out basis, Angelique.
Yeah, I'm constantly telling my students, how often do you allow a vendor or a supplier to come in the back door with their duffel bag of stuff into the surgeon locker room, for example, or they're there hanging out in back hallways trying to wait for that perfect moment to meet with their best friend, either the surgeon or the clinician of some sort. So we're always constantly talking about that.
I'll wrap myself out. So I used to work for a large equipment manufacturer and service organization when I first got into this business. We had service techs that would park in the loading dock. They could be there anywhere from 1 to 3 or 4 days a week, sometimes every day of the week. And my classic move to skirt around credentialing was to wear a suit and then go park behind my service vehicle, talk to my repair technician, who everybody in the hospital knew because they really kind of seemed like they were a day-to-day employee, as much of a presence that they had there. And they'd have a hospital ID badge. It would allow them to open up the elevators, even if they were badge restricted. So I'd walk with my repair tech. We'd go right in through the loading dock, go to the elevator and sterile processing, say hi to our friends, go up the elevator, and I'm in the OR with a decision maker in less than 5 minutes. And there really, to your point, aren't a lot of controls in the loading dock. It's one of the most troublesome areas in hospitals today as they try to gatekeep, in a more traditional sense, how people are accessing their hospitals.
Yeah. Well, and that's why another reason why value analysis is really growing across the country, because we want that to kind of be the gatekeeper of all new product introduction, right? And I just feel that having that robust structure built for your value analysis, married with what you are talking about here today, will give you a really good, tight system.
Yeah, and you can go to the next slide, but I'll kind of, add some color commentary on what you just said there about value analysis. When you implement a vendor credentialing program, regardless of how broad your scope is, there's a lot of attention on it during the implementation phase. There's a lot of communication that goes out to your vendors. There's a lot of organizational awareness. And there's this idea that all of a sudden operations will stop if people aren't compliant. And so there's a sense of urgency. But after you get through that implementation period, it's how do you sustain the program? And value analysis can be an excellent tool for making sure that vendor companies and vendor representatives are notified after that initial period when they're just starting to support your organization of what are the credentialing requirements. It really shouldn't be that a vendor rep finds out who you're using for credentialing the first day they show up and see a kiosk in the lobby, right? And so I definitely agree with you. Value analysis, there's going to be, I think, more and more invested in that. And it's sort of like, how are organizations entering your healthcare ecosystem? And then how do we manage the reps? So we got to get more upstream with some of that communication.
Totally
Um,
agree.
we like to say, and I don't want to spend necessarily a ton of time on this slide, but we like to say that, really the hospital's front line of defense is credentialing. And, we said here stops risk at the door. I'd say in many cases that's current state, but we really should be upstream with the value analysis component and communicating that. But it's that infection control. It protects staff and patients from harm, and that financial and operational integrity. You can see some things there, but If you wanted to get into some good stories, we can go to the next slide.
I love stories. We love real life stories.
All right. So I'm going to set the table on the stories by saying if you look at this slide, just consider right now how many of these categories do you have in some sort of screening program? I'm not even saying vendor credentialing. I'm saying, do you have a standardized process for knowing the individuals that represent support in these categories when they come on site? And then I'll ask you a second question, which is how many of them get access badges that make them look like they're an employee? And do you screen them before you give them those vendor badges or those hospital ID badges that they can then move freely throughout your organization? This slide is a great heat check for just how comprehensive your program is today.
Yeah, well, and just where I work today, we really look at construction, facilities, all of those kind of get managed through security because those folks are probably coming on site every single day. And they don't look at them as they're selling something new every time they come in. They're coming to paint something or work on drywall or work on electrical or work on the boilers or the chillers or the generators and stuff like that. And so they're not looking at it as someone that could possibly start to change your financial projection.
Yep.
However, for me, a service provider has all different kinds of control around trying to talk an employee into signing a new service agreement of some sort or expanding and doing some kind of a change order on the current scope of work, right? And so I think that we all need to be looking at it in that way that yes, they're a technician, they're not technically a salesperson, but it is kind of in their job to suggest new things to be happening, or hey, I was working on your plumbing, but I also saw over here this needs to be fixed. And that's not necessarily an upsell, but a change order to current scope of work. And I feel like it's their job to try to get more work. So
And
I think
even if
people should
they
look at
don't,
it.
even if they don't, Angelique, like the whole idea that the only people we need to vet are the sales vendors,
Yeah.
I would challenge that and say, yeah, but the people that are working in these areas here, are
Mhm.
often getting access to places that, the sales vendors don't get access to. And they
True.
are working in areas like electrical, et cetera. And so, are they qualified? And let's go a step further. If you're going to talk about facilities and construction, it's also like if they are supposed to be there on a service schedule, do you know if they're performing to that service schedule? If they're billing you for time and materials, do you
Mhm.
know if they were actually there for the time that they're billing you? And even when you come back over to like service vendors, I talk about, repair services because that's an area I know really well, but those service technicians, they're scheduled to be there. They might they might need to be there 3 days a week, 8 hours a day. But what happens if they're showing up late at 9 and they're leaving at 1? You and I both know that the purchase services is a really tough one to tackle from a quality standpoint because
Yeah.
you don't really know if there's a problem until maybe somebody in the operating room or whatever the department is calls you and says, "Where is this technician? I'm getting complaints from the surgeon on these instruments. Were they really here when they were supposed to be here?" And then you're engaged in a real he said, she said, and you wind up going out to maybe RFP. But to start to pull that data in and get a good look on, are they actually coming, on the service schedule that's been outlined in the SLAs of an agreement, this can really help you put some quality into those conversations and some data behind the discussion.
Wow. I was never even thinking about using it in that way to just to be monitoring check-in and check-out times, dates, to see that they even match like an invoice of what you're being billed. That is mind-blowing. And matching that up against your SLA, your service level agreement and your contract to make sure that as they're doing that service, it's within the scope and how long they should really be there. I mean, if I was in supply chain, I'm not understanding how long it takes to service a boiler, let's just say. Sure, there's a 37-point inspection that needs to be done and change out of certain parts every quarter or whatever it may be. But I wouldn't personally know, and neither would any of my contract administrators know, that that takes 7 hours of work or that takes 3 exact hours of work. And if Skippy came in to work on the boiler and he was here for a half hour and billed for the full service, my team would never even know, we
And you're
wouldn't
not
penalize.
necessarily going to do this on like a grand scale where you're looking
Right.
at every single contract. I think it's a tool for helping you to identify where there might be an opportunity,
Yeah, you
right?
could do
So,
like an audit.
as you look at strategic sourcing and you broaden that out into like, I've heard a lot like it's non-clinical, it's indirect spend, it's purchase service, this category is getting really broad and it's getting a lot of attention right now. And so what tools do we already have at our disposal that can help us evaluate those contracts for an opportunity? Maybe you're looking at savings but you don't want to. A lot of times what happens is there's a personal relationship between maybe these on-site technicians that are there a lot, and you see this in the clinical value analysis space already, so it still plays out in service vendor categories as well. And so you might be a little apprehensive of, bringing a category forward where that individual has a really great relationship with the department head. But if you can bring some real empirical data to the conversation, in addition to the savings piece, you might actually open some eyes. And worst case scenario, you don't make a change, but you get much better service because you're paying attention to it.
Yeah. Wow. This is great, Justin. This is great.
Yeah. So we can go to the next slide. Just, as we talk about some of the safety components, this is an example of one of the dangers that might exist by just blanketly giving out hospital ID badges to these service vendors and saying, hey, the screenings that are being done for them are, covered in the contract. But the truth is, we're not really validating any of that. We don't know to what degree they're being screened. The contracts very rarely say, we want it to be screened against the National Sex Offender Registry. We want it screened at national and county levels. This is the acceptance criteria. Like, it's really just whatever the supplier or the contractor company says it is. And so there's not a lot of standardization as it exists in this space. And so one example I have is a hospital that had a contract with a company to wash windows inside of, hospital rooms. And so the contract was sourced by supply chain, and it was kind of unique that way. And so the supply chain said, hey, if we're going to own this contract and you're going to get a hospital ID badge, we want you to go to another level. We want you to go through our vendor credentialing solution, and we want you to be vetted before we give you that badge. So this hospital thought that they were going this extra mile, and they had a visitor management system, and our visitor management system and many others have a functionality for screening against the National Sex Offender Registry. So the company signed up, I don't know, 100 plus workers, and they ran them through the credentialing solution. And at the time, this is going back a few years, but the credentialing solution accepted an attestation letter for the background screenings for these 100 folks. Well, one day, one of the workers had lost their hospital ID badge, and they showed up at the door, and they went to the security desk and said, I lost my ID badge. I need to get a replacement. And they said, well, the security offices for badging don't open up until like 10 a.m. Just go through the visitor management line for now and get a badge. And then you can go over at 10 o'clock and get a replacement. But somebody from your team is going to have to open doors in the meantime for you. And when they went through the visitor management line, they were actually flagged as a sex offender. Every state's got different levels, but they were a level 3, which is the highest level in that particular state. And they had somebody who had committed an egregious offense against a minor who had been given a hospital ID badge, and they thought they had gone to an extra level of scrutiny for that population. And it's part of the reason we built our model around annual background checks and have actually gone to monthly continuous monitoring today. I'm not saying, and I'm not accusing vendors that are running rampant with this background. It's kind of one of those things where Yeah, sure. A couple of situations, spoil the barrel type of deal. But in that particular customer, we've screened out over 400 individuals since they came to us to solve this problem for them. And so it is real. There are definitely some gaps. And I just think hospitals should know that they have the same peace of mind for these non employee populations as they do for their employees, especially in today's world. You can't prevent everything, things are still going to happen, but there are certain things you can control. And I think you should try to control as much as you can without deterring operations and hospital operations because we know the financial pressures they're under as well.
Yeah. Well, and making sure that you're covering all the populations that were on that last slide. I don't know what percentage of trauma vendor representatives or that come in at
Right.
midnight for trauma cases because they bring in trunk stock in their car for a case, are having a background issue, but possibly some of those other populations of vendors on that list could maybe fall in some of
And I
those
do have
areas.
examples among, the sales rep population as well. It's rare. To your point, they tend to have more sophisticated human resources processes in place.
Yeah.
But we have identified gaps and significant ones like felony assault that have gotten through the cracks, and then we've been able to catch it. So
Well, thank goodness for a vendor credentialing system.
I
I
got
love
one
it.
more story that's going to challenge your
Oh,
scope. You can go to the next slide, but the
okay.
last one is really talking about service vendors. But like this can go even broader if you really think about it. Like, what about the students that are coming in? How do they fit into your program? How are you standardizing what the acceptance criteria is for giving access to your facility? And in this case, a lot of the people 2 slides ago, they're not having any patient access. Like it's still a concern. They are going to be around patients potentially, but they're not providing direct patient care. And, I was a nursing student once and I remember what, it was like, but I don't remember going through a screening. And I definitely got a hospital badge where I did my hospital rotation. I might have gone through some screenings. I just don't remember. But there are incidences where the same thing could pop up. You've got a non-employee population. How are the students being screened? And in this case, an FNP for family nurse practitioner was flagged during a routine screening as potentially non-compliant, and then they had a sexual assault of a minor charge as well. Um, so, if you're not monitoring these things, I mean, that could be a big risk to the organization, especially like if something does happen on site, just think about what that does in terms of like the communications. You got to look back and impact. I mean, that can be very disruptive. So, having the peace of mind that you've screened everybody to some of these, more risky scenarios and just, hey, you know what? Got the box checked. That doesn't mean that somebody hasn't been charged with something and they don't still have the propensity, but again, control what you can control.
Do most of these students come in through like an outsourced program or like a traveling
It
nursing
varies.
program, or become their employees?
It varies. And, like in this case, we're talking about a nursing student, but, I went to a tech school for, to be a CNA. And I did rotations in nursing homes before I got my nursing degree. I was doing that while I was going to school. You've got respiratory therapists, you've got PTs. So if you start thinking about just clinical students in general, it could vary quite a bit. There are definitely nursing programs that utilize a third party to kind of go through a little bit of this, and they may or may not do a background check. But what's interesting is it's typically not the hospital that's owning that process. And you don't
Right.
even necessarily have visibility to when the students are on site, when they're scheduled to be on site. So, this is another area where, with collaboration with some of those third parties or directly with the school, you could start to get some visibility to like, hey, when were the students here? Because if you think about this from the perspective of emergency preparedness and response planning, like the number one thing you've got to know is who's in your building and how can you account for them and where were they and did they even leave? And that can be a real challenge in today's environment because you might have a paper logbook in facilities. You've got a visitor management system that may or may not be electronic. You may or may not be collecting any information on the visitors. You may not be able to communicate to them. You've got the vendor population. Then you've got all of these hospital ID badges that are going to service vendors, and you might not even know they're there unless they scan at one of the, Prox card at one of the doors. And so collating the information, you can find out about your employees thanks to punch clocks pretty fast. But we're outsourcing services more and more and more every day. The
Yes.
last 10 years has seen an explosion in outsourced services. So how do you get a handle on who was there that day? And I'm not talking about necessarily something as, unfortunate as an active shooter event, which did actually happen in my hometown at a hospital here in Pennsylvania. But you also might just be talking about, what about an explosion or a chemical leak? There are things that happen, related to like hurricanes, depending on where you're located.
Mhm.
Uh, it can be a big part of your planning to just have a single source of truth on who from the non-employee population is in the hospital or the healthcare facility that day.
I love it. I would put our traveling nurses through it too. I think that's important. Wow, great, Justin. Next slide.
Yeah, we're running out of time, so I'll kind of
Okay.
tie this all up, but it's like, can you get ongoing notifications? I kind of detailed the background check piece, but that's really why, I don't want to belabor the point about our company. I know it's not a sales pitch, but I think constant improvement in this areas is important. And one of the questions we always got was, yeah, but what happens if something, you do your annual background check? What happens if they get arrested 2 months later? We're not going to find out for 10 more months. It's a good question. My answer used to be, well, it's still better than not getting a background check at all.
Yeah.
But now it's sort of like, no, we gotta go to another level. And so now it's
Wow.
really ongoing notifications and checking, those databases on a monthly basis to ensure that nothing's happened midstream.
Wow. Okay, that's great. So when you're trying to choose a vendor credentialing company, because there's several out there like Green Security, you'd want to
Mhm.
ask some of these important questions.
Yeah, and I think some other things too are just implementation and how involved are you on a day-to-day basis and helping us with our strategy to implement a program that's got high compliance, and how do you solve for, removing maybe some of that manual effort from the clinical leadership or, clinicians to help manage compliance and procedural areas, and then let alone some of the other non-clinical departments within the facility.
Sounds good. Yeah, I'm always getting asked from some of my students, like, what would be possible RFP questions for that product category or that service category. So, vendor credentialing being a service category, I mean, you were just talking about some major things they should be asking while going through that RFP process. Give me one really, really hot thing they should ask during an RFP process for vendor credentialing.
Yeah, I think it's, what does the customer success team look like? How robust is the implementation? Hospitals typically don't have the resources to lead this project. A
No.
lot of times they think it's a bigger project than it is. It's not as big. It's not an epic integration. Like a lot of times that's what I'll hear is like, oh, this is touching every department in the hospital. So this is like, doing Epic again and or Workday. I can't do another ERP. And I get that, but it's not that project. But I can tell you it does touch every department in the hospital, especially if you take a broad scope. So what does the implementation process look like? Who's involved? How many resources are you getting? And then how are you? We hear so much about sustainability, and it's not just like, green initiatives and, sustainability from, kind of like our impact on the environment, but sustainability from the standpoint of, if we're going to implement a new program, sure, we're going to get great compliance early on, but how are we going to make sure that we hold, well, all that great work together and build on that in the future? So, I would want to know, how available is your team even post implementation? So I say customer success because that really covers implementation and everything that happens afterwards to help you have a high compliance program.
I love it. I love it. So, if any of my students out there who are watching this recording, if you're going to be going out for an RFP in this space for vendor credentialing, reach out to me. If we need to reach out to Justin and ask some questions, I am more than happy to do a connection because I think that's super important. Okay, last slide.
Yeah, this one will just kind of help you. I just talked about how sustainable is your program. This is a great heat check for you. You can click on that QR code. You can take the survey, answer some questions, and identify where the strengths and vulnerabilities might be in your compliance program and figure out, okay, where do we need to target our efforts? And what's super interesting, Joint Commission's changing the way that they're doing things next year. It's not one of these things where you want to just look at your survey readiness when the window's approaching and then tidy it up. Like, you're going to end up having to maintain a lot of that. And so this is a great way to be survey ready, to get some guidance around that just for the vendor credentialing piece. And I recommend taking a look at a lot of the different areas of compliance and your program and chunking it out so that maybe you spend a couple of hours every quarter looking at certain aspects of your program to make sure that you've maintained the not only the compliance but the integrity of the program, but not make it a huge lift. And so I feel like this survey that we've developed can just kind of help you get a quick look at that and thinking in the right direction for how you build out your program.
That is amazing. Well, I want to thank you so much, Justin, for being a guest on my Learning Bites today. You've done so much education in this last 30 minutes. I'm sure all of my students and all of my followers are absolutely going to love it. And please, everybody, if you have any more questions, reach out to me. I can always get a hold of Justin. I have his cell phone, I promise. And if you guys, if you don't have vendor credentialing in your hospital or in your health system, please take this serious. So thank you, Justin. I appreciate you.
Angelique, likewise. Thank you so much for having me today.
Okay, sounds good. I'm going to end this and I hope everybody has a great rest of your day. Thanks, everybody.